History Summary Ancient Civilization Part 2. Ancient Civilization in India. Be familiar with the essential geography of India, its extent, the Ganges and Indus Valleys, the Deccan Plateau, the island of Sri Lanka, the monsoon climactic pattern in East India, India as unified more as social and cultural whole rather than politically, the present-day religious divisions of India. The enigma of the Harappan Civilization in the Indus Valley, passed through the agricultural revolution about 6500 BCE, and then to civilization by the 3 RC millennium BCE. Western archeologists did not discover any remains until the 1920s. The civilization seems in many ways similar to Sumer. Agricultural economy, walled cities, autonomous city-states that traded and probably warred among themselves. Two major cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Harappa apparently went through a period of decay in the 2nd millennium BCE, and was progressively overrun by the Aryans, a subgroup of the Indo-European tribes of origins around the Black Sea, who migrated to areas such as Ireland, France, Germany, Italy, and Greece in this period. The Aryans were relatively light-skinned and established themselves as a kind of elite over the dark-skinned native peoples, sometimes called Dravidians, descended from the Harappans. The peoples of southern India remained more dark-skinned. The Aryans brought their chiefs rajas, who often coalesced larger political units under maharajas. They brought iron implements and turned the Ganges Valley into one of the great fertile regions of world agriculture. The true Aryans had very little to do with the Aryan racial theories advanced by Nazis and other European and North American racists in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Mauryan Empire was created by Chandragupta Maurya at the end of the 3rd century BCE. It was quite despotic in structure with a large army and bureaucracy. The Mauryans followed the Hindu practice of ruling benevolently in the interests of their people. Most of the information we have about his reign comes from the Greek writer Megasthenes. The Greeks loved to investigate and write. The caste system in ancient India is a particularly rigid version of ancient hierarchical societies. Much of it is based on color distinctions between upper caste Aryans and lower caste Dravidians. The 4 main castes are Brahmins, Kshatriya, Vaisya, Sudras, and Untouchables, the last of which is not really part of the caste system, are rigorously separated, not eating together, not intermarrying, performing assigned economic functions, etc. The untouchables perform the worst jobs and are true outcasts. In the 20th century, Mohandas Gandhi campaigned against the caste system. Discrimination against the untouchables was outlawed by the 1946 Indian Constitution. Women had a particularly low status in ancient India, always considered minors, cannot own property, etc. Note the tradition of the sati where women are expected to sacrifice themselves on the funeral pyres of their husbands. Codified by the law of Manu. The Ramayana provides opportunity for class discussion. The discussion focused on 4 topics. 1. Rama as the typical Indian hero. He was a great warrior, but also had important civilian virtues such as conscientiousness, concern for the well-being of his subjects, fidelity to his word, a certain amount of prudence. He does make some mistakes, carelessly allowing Sita to be kidnapped, unjustly accusing Sita of infidelity, etc., but they are always corrected, and he appears to learn from them. 2. The divine and mortal in the world of Indian myth. The two are thoroughly mixed, a contrast with modern secular assumptions of Western society. The world peopled with devils. Human and divine natures are often mixed, as in the case of Rama, an avatar of Vishnu, and Sita. Combat takes place with supernatural weapons, incantations, mantras, etc. If someone appears to you, you always ask the question of whether it is a supernatural illusion. 3. The status of women. In general, women should remain in the private sphere, stay at home. They are powerful because of their influence over men, and men don't resist female beauty. They are dangerous because of their willfulness and must be resisted. Many of the bad decisions made by men in the story are because of the influence of women such as Kaikeyi and Supanaka, as she is an Asura. Sita is the ideal of the woman, beautiful, sensible, restrained, virtuous, domestic and faithful. For every person in the story is subject to dharma, his duty, his own moral code, which in Hindu tradition can vary from caste to caste. The story is fascinated with moral debate of which there are several. Characters stop fairly often to discuss what is right, wrong or proper. No one seems to have any compunction about speaking out on important subjects, for example, whether it was proper for Rama to have killed Vali. The story is a strong melodrama. The good guys are clearly separated from the bad guys, and the former win in the long run. The story has a happy ending. Even the evil characters tend to repent from their evil ways when they are dying. Indian religion has had a particularly powerful impact on the world. Yoga, vegetarianism, and Zen Buddhism are quite popular in contemporary USA. Hinduism is the original religion that grew out of the experience following the Aryan invasion. Its classic texts are the Vedas and the Upanishads. There was a great reform flux in Hinduism about the time of Siddhartha, a 6th century BCE. It is very complex and constantly changing shape. For example, just who are the chief gods in the Indian pantheon? It is polytheistic, the main gods often being Brahman, a creation, Vishnu, a preserver, and Shiva, a destroyer. It has two sets of practices for ordinary Indians: one the way of sacrifice, accept success and comfort in the world and satisfy the gods with animal and other sacrifices. The priests are very important for knowing what you need to do to attain salvation. 2. Asceticism, kind of the opposite extreme, deny oneself all pleasure of life as sex, meat, comfort, etc., even some forms of self-mutilation. Mostly Brahmins are active here. Modern-day yoga comes out of asceticism, although self-mutilation was not the norm among ascetics. Hinduism believes in reincarnation, i.e., the individual soul, Atman, may move up the ladder of creation to final fulfillment, union with Brahman. The scale more or less corresponds to the different ranks of the caste system, with animals listed below. The most exalted animal is the cow. At each level the individual has a dharma that is peculiar to that stage. You accumulate karma while alive. If you have good karma, you may move on to the next stage through apparent death and reincarnation. You eventually escape from the world to union in a dreamless sleep with Brahman. It may however take a long time. Buddhism. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, founded this religion, although he probably did not mean to found a new religion. He was dissatisfied with Hinduism, which he found too complex, too hierarchical, and too extreme. After living lives of secular enjoyment, and then of extreme asceticism, he experienced enlightenment as a young man under a bo tree. Buddhism is probably best seen as reformed Hinduism, admittedly a rather radical one. Buddha accepted the Hindu ideas of karma, reincarnation and fulfillment, which he called nirvana. Nirvana would bring peace and serenity as individuals renounce their individuality and dependence on material things. He denied the objective existence of the individual soul, and proclaimed the individual and the material world an illusion. Reality was spirit. In his Benes sermon, he proclaimed the Four Noble Truths and the Middle Way, in which he opted for a more consistent, simpler, and egalitarian religious way. As an ethic he preached renunciation without self-mutilation. Buddha did not claim to be God, but in later centuries, many of his followers did state that he was a worldly manifestation of the world spirit. The spread of Buddhism was sure and persistent, although sometimes slow. The Mauryan king Asoka, after spending his earlier years fighting, converted to Buddhism. Thereafter, he ruled in a more public-spirited manner, and promoted Buddhism missionaries and monasteries throughout India. He renounced public violence, and proclaimed tolerance in his reign. All the conquests were to be made by persuasion. He erected inscribed pillars throughout his domains to explain his values. His son carried the religion to Sri Lanka. Buddhism later spread to Asia, first to Southeast Asia, Thailand and Myanmar, and then over the Silk Road to China, where it became the quintessential Chinese religion. From China it continued to Korea and Japan, and later to Indochina. Buddhism became enrooted in India, but was never practiced by more than a small minority of the Indian population. The Mauryan Empire split up shortly after the death of Asoka, and India returned to a 500-year period of political disunity. Ancient China. The oldest continuous civilization, a contrast with the instability of the West, although it originated at least a millennium after the older civilizations. The geography of ancient China. Civilization originated first on the Yellow River, later spreading to the Yangtze River Valley under the Zhou dynasty. China is relatively isolated from the rest of the world. The mythology of the founding of China, the gifts brought by the gods Fu 11, Shen Nung and Huang Ti. The Shan dynasty c. 1700 BCE, 1100 BCE. Grew up in North China. Some speculation by archeologists that the civilization might be influenced by Indo-European invaders, whose remains have been discovered recently in Xinjiang province. Governance was largely feudal or aristocratic in this period. Contrast the tradition of bureaucratic central rule, typical of most phases of Chinese history, and a feudal system, a government by personal relationship, which is much less effective as central government. The Shan, known for their bronzes. Overthrown around 1100 BCE by the Zhou dynasty, a bigger state that embraces the Yangtze Valley, and which decreases the power of the nobility. The state is more centralized, and the emperor is thought to rule with the mandate of heaven, Tian Ming, by which he has responsibility to implement the laws of the universe in China. If the emperor doesn't do a good job, he is subject to being overthrown, and replaced by a ruler who will do better. The last phase of the Zhou was characterized by internal conflict, the era of the warring states. The economy was prosperous, development of a merchant class closely supervised by the state that exported silk products along the Silk Road, invention of coinage, technological innovations such as iron plowshares and natural fertilizer, a strong tradition of public works, especially to control flooding along the rivers and to provide irrigation water. About this time the Chinese develop their ideographic and pictographic language that soon has thousands of characters. Chinese never evolves into a phonetic system, partly because of the beauty of Chinese writing or calligraphy, but mainly because the written language is an important unifying force in China. Development of a privileged and valuable class of scribes, scholars who make up the backbone of the future Chinese bureaucracy. The high prestige of scholars and learning in traditional Chinese society. The 100 schools of ancient philosophy. Things going poorly in the late Zhou, the period of the warring states. This prompts a rethinking of the basics of ethics and political theory, and leads to the golden age of Chinese philosophy. These thinkers interested less in religion, theology, metaphysics, etc., and more in principles of right behavior, ethics, and political and social theory. They influence educated folk and intellectuals, and hardly at all the common people. One of the most conservative of the schools was legalism. The most famous proponent was Han Fei, a noble educated under the Confucian system, who advised Shi Huangdi before he became emperor. Shi Huangdi had him executed before taking over his ideas. Legalists believed that human nature was essentially destructive, and that the only way to attain a certain level of harmony and happiness was by detailed legal codes with draconian punishments that would deter antisocial behavior. The most important political factor is doing the will of the ruler, not looking to some code of behavior. 2. By far the most popular and influential was Confucianism, developed by the great teacher Confucius in the 6th century BCE. He was a pragmatist and a moderate, and concerned primarily with secular rather than religious issues. Every individual has the duty to follow his dao, the way, which is the proper behavior for a person of that station. Even the ruler must follow his dao, which was to see universal law brought down to earth. If the individual does his duty, then the family does its duty, and so on up the line to the ruler. He developed ethical values of humanity, which included compassion, empathy, the the golden rule do not do unto others as you would not have them doing unto you, tending toward a serene repose and a calmness of mind. He thought the state must be reformed, mainly by giving preference to the meritorious, who would dominate the state.